I think the most pressing issue facing American higher education is student debt. How are students going to pay the bills to attend higher education in the United States? The academically adrift authors did a follow-up study after that very interesting book and controversial book that found that the average student had a debt of $27,000 a year, and yet they were only earning a little over $34,000 a year in income from the jobs they were taking part in. And that didn't include graduate students. So what student debt does is it not only forces students to make a lot of choices when they're in the system, but in the end, when they're having to pay off these debts, they're having to delay a lot of things that normally they would be doing, like getting married, like buying a house, like perhaps going to graduate school, which then adds even more debt. I think we were all staggered when we heard that the total amount of student debt in the United States exceeded all of the credit card bill debt in the United States and the total of all auto loans in the United States. So that illustrates a huge change that's taken place. Now what that means is that students begin to question the value of the courses they're taking. And many of us believe strongly in a liberal arts education. But when students are having to face those kinds of debt loads immediately upon graduating, they have to begin thinking about, is this class going to help me fulfill my career goals? Many of us would argue that liberal arts education does that, but it forces students to ask questions about perhaps doing those liberal arts courses in a general education package in less expensive ways. So the ramifications of student debt are huge, not just in terms of student choices, but in how they conduct their lives after they graduate, and it also forces young people to decide whether they can even afford to go to college. So we have some tough decisions to be making in the next few years as we try to make higher education more affordable. Of course, we've got the rich institutions. I think a lot of us were startled with the news that a California student would actually pay on a net basis less to go to Harvard, Yale, or Princeton than by attending a CSU or a UC campus, because those institutions could give them so much more money for student tuition discounts. So there are a lot of ramifications of the importance of student debt. I know there have been a lot of questions about how higher education should respond to the changing ecology, all this open software and do-it-yourself education, the swirl that's taking place in American higher education. I think we often try to think of higher education as the traditional student. Graduates at 18 years of age from high school, continues directly on to higher education, often in a residential setting, a beautiful university campus, and yet the reality is that only about 20% of all students in higher education in America fit that traditional model. I think what that means is that we have to be a lot more open to different ways of educating the 80% that are not the traditional student market. And all of these options that we've been concerned about are going to have to come into play. Is a student that perhaps is in their early 40s with 2 or 3 kids, maybe even some of them in college, wanting to come back and get an education, do they have the same kinds of social needs, the same kinds of support needs as does an 18-year-old student that's just leaving the high school and perhaps finding out who they are, the independence that comes from perhaps leaving home and being in one of those traditional college settings, perhaps not close to home? I think the needs may be different, and so we have to be a lot more open and flexible in looking at the variety of educational opportunities. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at that for traditional age students as well, those 18 to 24-year-olds, because they've grown up with a different kind of culture in terms of these kinds of technology needs. When my granddaughter, who's 4 years old, can be talked to from us on a cruise ship in the middle of the Baltic Sea from our room, and when we get home and we say goodbye to her in person, and she responds, "See you online," that tells you that if a 4-year-old is already being exposed to that, are we going to be able to educate them in the same ways as perhaps we would in the past? So I think we have to be very open to new ways of delivering education. So how do we go about transforming higher education to meet the new needs that we are facing in the United States and other countries? I think that we're going to have to be open to a lot of new possibilities while recognizing that there will be some older and wealthy institutions that will probably continue operating pretty much as they always have. I don't think we're going to transform some of those institutions. We shouldn't worry about it. But for some of the smaller institutions, some of those that perhaps are challenged with enrollment, or perhaps even in the state of California or Hawaii, where we have these university systems that aren't receiving the same kind of financial support from the state that they have in the past, will by necessity have to transform themselves through looking at every position, every program that's being offered to determine if they can continue to afford that model. I think it's also going to force us to look more actively at different kinds of consortiums where institutions work together so that they're not all trying to offer the same kinds of classes and programs, but they can maintain their unique mission while at the same time sharing some coursework that would help them reduce costs because they wouldn't have to hire as many professors to perhaps manage all of those programs. We have a lot of smaller institutions that are trying to operate as if they're comprehensive institutions, and that can never happen. And in the process, they reduce the quality. By sharing with each other, I think those opportunities can help reduce costs in the process, in the terms of the way it goes forward. However, I also think that as members of the public, we need to continue to pressure our state legislatures in Hawaii and California to continue to maintain higher education's value and the subsidies from the state so that we don't have, as we say, state-located systems, but rather we continue to have state-sponsored systems. The genius of these states and the genius of the United States has been its support of public education and the public universities in our society that have enabled young people of all kinds of income levels to be able to go and achieve their dreams. If we give up on that, it will be a huge loss for our society. And I think we have a responsibility to continue to pressure our public leaders to keep funding at a high level. And we as voters need to be willing to also fund that through our taxes and through our willingness to perhaps give up some aspects of what we have enjoyed so that we continue to maintain a strong K-12 and a strong public university system.